The sun had barely risen over the city skyline, casting long shadows between tall buildings that held lives Margaret no longer felt a part of. She sat on a patch of concrete near the corner of a bustling downtown avenue, where the foot traffic never ceased. Her back hunched, joints stiff in the cold night air, and her hands rested in her lap. Fingers curled with the tension of someone who had learned not to expect anything anymore. Margaret was 74 years old, once a mother, a grandmother, a cook who loved cinnamon on everything, a woman who danced in the kitchen when her husband brought her sunflowers on ordinary Tuesdays. Now, she was invisible. Her silver gray hair was tied in a practical bun, strands fraying from wind and neglect. She wore a coat 2 sizes too large, picked from a donation bin last winter, and her shoes, one missing a sole, were held together by duct tape and quiet dignity. Her belongings, few and worn, were stored in a grocery bag that never left her side. Next to her feet sat a piece of cardboard with shaky handwriting that read, "I'm hungry. Anything helps." Margaret had written those words weeks ago and stopped rewriting them. The ink had faded, the edges were torn, but no one noticed. Hundreds passed her each day, office workers with lattes in one hand and phones in the other, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Parents wheeling strollers, teenagers with backpacks and earbuds, people on their way somewhere, always too fast to look. And so Margaret sat in silence, the sounds of life swirling around her, car horns, snippets of conversations, the hiss of buses pulling in and out. Behind her, a cafe served breakfast sandwiches and fresh croissants, and the smell drifted toward her like a cruel taunt. She could remember the scent of cinnamon rolls baking in her own oven years ago, when her grandson still visited and she could afford to treat them. Now, she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. A half-eaten granola bar, given by a kind stranger whose face she never saw again, was all that had touched her lips. Her stomach ached quietly, but it wasn't just hunger, it was the ache of being forgotten. Margaret watched people through a lens of fading hope. She had tried talking to a few in her early days on the street, offering smiles, asking gently for help, but their reactions had taught her to retreat. Some ignored her completely. Others quickened their pace or tightened their grip on their bags. The worst ones muttered insults under their breath, as if her presence was an offense to the order of their day. At first, she'd felt shame, then anger, then something worse, numbness. As the hours dragged on, she shifted on her flattened cardboard, trying to ease the pressure on her hips. Her knees ached, her hands trembled from both the cold and the fatigue. She counted the coins in her plastic cup, 37 cents. Not enough for anything, not even a coffee. She watched people laughing inside the cafe, couples sharing plates, children sipping hot chocolate with whipped cream. Her eyes welled up, but she blinked quickly. She wouldn't cry in public. Not anymore. By late afternoon, the shadows stretched long again, and the energy of the street began to change. People were leaving work now, walking faster, focused on getting home. The temperature dropped a few degrees, and Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her frail body. She hadn't spoken a word all day. Not one. She thought of her family. Her husband, gone 8 years now. Her daughter, whom she hadn't spoken to in 5. Grandchildren whose birthdays she still remembered by heart. She had lost everything gradually, like water draining from a cup with a hole at the bottom. Medical bills had eaten through their savings. The house went next. The rest unraveled slowly. Her belongings, her pride, her connection to the world. She had tried shelters. Most were overcrowded or unsafe, and she'd been robbed twice. She preferred the street now. At least there, she had space to breathe. As darkness approached, she adjusted the cardboard sign by her feet. Her hands were shaking more than usual. A woman walked by, dropped her coffee cup in the trash just inches away, and didn't even glance at her. Margaret sighed quietly. Her voice was rough from disuse, almost a whisper to herself. Am I invisible now? No one answered. No one heard. The city continued to move around her, indifferent. But across the street, near a bookstore window, a pair of eyes had noticed. Young, wide, curious. A boy stood holding his mother's hand, looking directly at Margaret, not with fear, not with pity, but something deeper. Margaret didn't notice him yet. She was lost in her memories again, staring at the glow of a sign advertising fresh soup. The boy didn't look away. Something, somewhere, was about to shift, just a little, enough to crack the silence of Margaret's invisible world. Ethan was 9 years old and full of questions about everything. He asked why dogs tilted their heads when you talked to them, why some leaves turned red before falling, and why some people smile with their mouths but not with their eyes. That afternoon, he had just finished his after-school program and was walking hand in hand with his mother through the busy downtown corridor, weaving between crowds of strangers, all with somewhere to be. The streets were loud and full of color. Vendors called out from food carts. Someone played a saxophone near the bus stop, and advertisements blinked across high-rise screens. Ethan was trying to keep up with his mother's pace, his backpack bouncing against his side with every step, when something made him slow down. Across the street, by the edge of a building, a woman sat on the ground. His feet came to a stop. His mother, still holding his hand, was tugged gently backward by a sudden halt. "Come on, Ethan, we need to get home before it gets dark," she said, glancing over her shoulder. But Ethan's eyes remained fixed. "Mom," he asked, his voice clear over the noise around them, "why is that lady sitting there like that?" His mother followed his gaze. She saw the elderly woman hunched near the curb, her hands in her lap, a worn sign propped beside her. The mother blinked, discomfort crossing her face, and gave a quick answer. "She's just asking for help. Don't stare. Let's go." But Ethan didn't move. His fingers loosened from hers, and before she could stop him, he stepped toward the curb, narrowing the distance between himself and the old woman. Margaret noticed the movement. At first, she expected another stranger walking past, another pair of legs to ignore. But these shoes stopped. Small, worn sneakers, still bright in color. She looked up slowly, her neck stiff. A boy stood in front of her, no taller than her seated height. His backpack was unzipped at the top, and a folded paper stuck out from one corner. Ethan's expression was not one of judgment or fear. It was a question in itself. His brows drawn together, his head slightly tilted. "Are you really hungry?" he asked, his voice soft, uncertain but genuine. Margaret blinked. It had been hours, maybe longer, since anyone had spoken to her directly. She hesitated, the question sitting heavy in the air. She gave a small nod. Ethan didn't move for a moment. Then he looked back toward his mother, who had started toward him with quick steps, her face now a blend of confusion and worry. "Ethan," she hissed, "come here right now. You don't talk to strangers, especially not like this." "She's not scary," Ethan said, turning to his mother but not backing away. "She's hungry." His mother stopped, only a few feet behind him now. She glanced at Margaret again, seeing not just the shape of a woman on the sidewalk, but the person within it. Creased eyes, thin lips, sun-touched skin, and a weariness that words couldn't explain. Ethan turned back to Margaret. Without a word, he slid his backpack from his shoulders and crouched down. From inside, he pulled a square package wrapped in crinkled foil. It was the lunch he hadn't eaten earlier, turkey and cheese on wheat bread made that morning. He held it out to her with both hands. Margaret looked at the sandwich, then at the boy's face. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice husky, almost ashamed to accept. Ethan nodded. "I can eat at home," he said, "but you might not have dinner. So you can have this one." Margaret swallowed, her throat tight, her hands now holding the warmth of the food. She didn't unwrap it right away. She simply stared at it, her eyes glistening with something deeper than tears. Gratitude, perhaps, but also disbelief. She had begged all day and been ignored. Now, here was a child offering her something as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His mother was quiet now. Her gaze moved between the woman and her son, and something shifted in her. She stepped closer, crouched beside Ethan, and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said softly to Margaret. I didn't see you before." Margaret gave a faint smile, touched not just by the food, but by the moment of recognition. "It's all right. Most people don't." A pause lingered between them. The sound of the city hummed in the background, but in that pocket of space on the sidewalk, time slowed. A young woman with a messenger bag stopped nearby, watching curiously. Then another man paused, then a couple walking their dog. The boy's simple gesture had caused a ripple. One by one, people stopped moving. The young woman stepped forward and pulled a small bottle of water from her purse. She handed it to Margaret without a word. A man in a dark coat reached into his wallet and held out a folded bill, $10. Another woman approached and laid a pair of granola bars beside the sandwich. Margaret's eyes were wide now, overwhelmed. Her hands, still holding Ethan's lunch, trembled more. But this time, not from hunger. From something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seeing, Ethan turned back to his mother. "Can we get her something else? Like a blanket or maybe a jacket? It's gonna get cold soon." His mother nodded slowly. "Yes, we can. We will." Margaret opened the sandwich slowly, the foil catching the last light of the afternoon. She took a small bite, closed her eyes, and exhaled through her nose. It wasn't just food. It was a reminder of being human. She looked at Ethan again. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice steadier. "You reminded me that kindness still exists." Ethan smiled shyly. His mother put an arm around him, and together they stood beside Margaret, no longer rushing to be somewhere else. Other people watched quietly, unsure whether to speak or to move, feeling the gravity of what had just happened. It hadn't been loud. It hadn't been dramatic, but it had cracked open something unspoken in everyone around. And Margaret, who had asked herself only hours ago if she'd become invisible, now found herself surrounded by eyes that truly saw her. The gathering around Margaret had begun to thin as the sky darkened into a soft blue-gray, the last traces of daylight fading into the skyline. Some of the people who had stopped to offer a bottle of water or a bill quietly moved on, returned to their lives, but not before casting one last glance at the old woman sitting beside her small pile of offerings. Still, something in the atmosphere had changed. There was no denying it. The air no longer buzzed with the same indifference it had earlier that day. There was a weight now, a shared recognition, hanging in the space where strangers had paused and noticed. Ethan, still standing near Margaret with his mother, looked around and then down at his now lightened backpack. His shoulders were slightly straighter than before, as though carrying the weight of a different kind of understanding. His mother, crouched beside him moments earlier, now stood quietly behind him, her phone in hand, uncertain whether to act on the impulse brewing inside her. She wasn't one to post videos of private encounters. She didn't think of herself as someone who broadcast moments for attention. But this wasn't about attention. It was about truth. "Do you mind if I take a little video?" she asked Margaret gently, her voice uncertain but sincere. "Just to share what happened. Maybe someone who knows you will see it, or someone who can help." Margaret looked at her with a long, unreadable expression. For a moment, she didn't speak, and the tension hung there, taut. Then, slowly, she nodded. There was no fight left in her for shame or pride, only the faint glimmer that perhaps, just perhaps, something good might come of this unexpected moment. The woman lifted her phone and began to record. She didn't stage the scene. She didn't frame it for drama. She simply let it breathe. The camera captured Margaret's weary face, the open sandwich in her lap. Ethan seated next to her now, gently swinging his legs. His voice, quiet but certain, spoke off camera. "I just wanted to help." She looked hungry. That's all. The video lasted less than a minute. It ended with Margaret's voice, hoarse but warm. "This boy reminded me that there's still kindness left in the world. Sometimes it only takes one person to notice." By the time they walked away, the woman had already uploaded the video. She didn't expect much. A few likes, perhaps, a couple of comments. But she felt the need to do something more than simply witness. She'd taken the first step, unaware that it would become something much larger than any of them imagined. That night, Margaret stayed in the same place she had for weeks. But it didn't feel the same. The sandwich had filled more than her stomach. It had given her a flicker of dignity she hadn't felt in years. She slept with the foil wrapper folded neatly beside her, as if it were a memento, a reminder that the day had been different. The next morning, long before the streets filled again, Margaret was already sitting up, alert. Her joints ached, and her limbs protested every movement. But there was a nervous energy pulsing beneath the surface of her skin. Something intangible stirred in her, as though her body had remembered how it felt to be looked at, spoken to, considered. She didn't know what the day would bring, but she hoped, not for miracles, but for a moment of peace. By mid-morning, the ripple effect had already begun. The video, uploaded just hours earlier, was being shared across social platforms. It didn't explode with fireworks, but spread quietly, passed along from mother to daughter, from co-worker to friend, each person feeling something stir inside them. The boy's simple act of kindness pierced through the noise of outrage, opinion, and distraction that fills so many timelines. People commented not with anger or debate, but with memories. Stories of their own encounters with homelessness, times they had helped or failed to help, and what they wished they had done differently. Back on the city's sidewalk, Margaret noticed the changes before she understood them. A woman with auburn hair approached, carrying a large paper bag. She knelt beside Margaret and gently placed the bag next to her. "There's soup in there, and bread, and a little fruit. Hope it's still warm." Margaret looked at her, stunned, and tried to respond, but the woman simply smiled, touched her shoulder lightly, and left. Minutes later, a man in a delivery uniform passed by, doubled back, and handed Margaret a fresh pair of gloves and thick socks. "Thought you could use these," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Then he was gone. She couldn't make sense of it. The attention, the care, the faces that now looked at her rather than through her. It was overwhelming, but not in a way that frightened her. It humbled her, cracked open something inside that had been sealed for too long. By early afternoon, a local news reporter arrived. Word had reached the station about the video. They wanted to find the boy, of course, but they also wanted to speak with the woman. Margaret was hesitant. She didn't want to become a spectacle, but the reporter was respectful, gentle in his tone, and promised not to twist her words. She agreed. They sat on a bench someone had brought over from nearby, and Margaret spoke with clarity and grace. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She spoke of her husband, of the illness that took their savings, of the quiet slide into homelessness. She mentioned her daughter, whom she hadn't spoken to in years, and the weight of shame that had silenced her. "I didn't know how to ask for help," she said. "And after a while, you stop expecting it. You start to believe you don't deserve it." The reporter thanked her, and the segment aired that evening. It wasn't long before people began asking questions. Had she once worked at the community center? Did she sing in the church choir on 8th Street? Was she the same Margaret who taught piano lessons from her home 2 decades ago? Old acquaintances began to recognize her, reaching out tentatively through email and comment threads. And somewhere, far from the city, a woman in her 40s sat on her living room couch, phone in hand, her eyes wide with recognition. Her hands trembled as she replayed the video. "Mom," she whispered aloud, even though no one else was there to hear. Meanwhile, back on the sidewalk, Margaret sat surrounded by new donations, unsure how to process any of it. She clutched a thermos of hot tea and stared across the street, half expecting to see Ethan again. She didn't know if she would. Children moved through life quickly, and moments like theirs were often fleeting. But the imprint remained. The boy's act, simple, quiet, undramatic, had sparked something she hadn't thought possible. Not a revolution, not a parade, but something far more rare. A moment of recognition in a world that often refused to look. By the end of that week, Margaret was no longer just a figure on the sidewalk. She had become a face people recognized, a voice they wanted to hear more from, a name that was whispered with a mixture of sympathy and something akin to admiration. The local news coverage had sparked not just curiosity, but a genuine outpouring of concern, and a flood of offers, meals, shelter, clothing, even messages from people in nearby towns offering temporary housing or help with medical care. But amid the growing attention, Margaret remained cautious. She had seen how quickly kindness could vanish, how promises made in good faith sometimes dissolved once the camera stopped rolling. What had happened with the boy had been real. She felt that in her bones. But everything that came afterward felt like a wave she wasn't sure how to ride. Still, something shifted when she was invited to sit down for a longer conversation. This time not for television, but for a small community-run initiative that focused on amplifying unheard voices. They didn't bring fancy cameras or scripted questions, just a small microphone and a young woman named Lena, who sat cross-legged on a folding chair in front of Margaret, a legal pad balanced on her knees, and a quiet respect in her expression. "We just want to know your story," Lena said, her voice calm, her tone devoid of judgment. "Not what's happened this week, but before, if you're comfortable." Margaret hesitated. She looked down at her hands that had once been calloused from years of chopping onions and scrubbing dishes, hands that had buttoned school uniforms and wiped away tears. Now, they trembled slightly in her lap. But Lena waited in silence, and somehow the absence of pressure gave Margaret room to breathe. She lifted her head. "I used to be a cook," she began, her voice raspier than usual but steady. "Not professionally. Just in my own kitchen. I made everything from scratch. Bread, soups, pies. My husband used to joke that if I ever opened a restaurant, he'd go broke from eating there every day." Lena smiled gently and jotted something down. Margaret's eyes wandered past her, as if she were watching her memories play out on an invisible screen. "We were married 39 years. Frank and me. We had one daughter, Marissa, and 2 grandsons. They used to come over every Sunday for dinner. I'd make pot roast and mashed potatoes, and they'd leave with leftovers for the week." Her voice caught slightly at the memory, but she didn't stop. It was a good life. Nothing fancy, but full. "What changed?" Lena asked quietly. Margaret let out a long breath, as though bracing herself. "Cancer," she said. "Frank got sick. It came fast and ugly. We thought we had more time, but we didn't. The hospital bills drained everything. Insurance didn't cover nearly enough, and we didn't qualify for assistance. By the time he passed, I was alone in debt and already behind on the mortgage. The house went not long after." Lena nodded but didn't speak, giving space for Margaret to continue. "I moved into a small apartment, but my health started to go too. Nothing dramatic, just aging joints, arthritis, blood pressure that wouldn't settle. I tried to work, cleaning houses, doing laundry, but I couldn't keep up. And then I stopped reaching out to my daughter." "Why?" "Shame," Margaret said, her voice sharper now. "Pride, too." She offered to help, but she had her own problems, her own kids. I didn't want to be a burden. So I told her I was fine, even when I wasn't. After a while, the calls stopped, and I didn't fight to keep them going. There was a pause. Lena wrote something, then asked, "And how did you end up here?" "On the street." Margaret looked down again. "I ran out of options. I couldn't keep up with rent, and I didn't want to drag anyone else down with me. I figured I could manage, just for a little while. But weeks turned to months. Shelters were full or unsafe, or too far from places where people passed by. So I stayed where there were people, even if they didn't see me." Her voice faded slightly at the end, as if she were remembering those long stretches of invisibility all over again. "But now people do see you," Lena said gently. "That little boy changed something." Margaret nodded slowly. "He did, and not just for me. I saw it on people's faces, like they were waking up from something." The recording went on for another 20 minutes. Margaret spoke of the coldest nights, the quietest mornings, the ache of hunger that gnawed more at her dignity than her stomach. She didn't dramatize her story. She simply told it with the rawness of someone who had lived it fully and no longer had anything to lose by telling the truth. When they finished, Lena thanked her, turned off the microphone, and handed her a copy of the release form, which Margaret signed without hesitation. It felt strange, giving permission for her pain to be shared, but also strangely necessary. Over the next 48 hours, that recording reached tens of thousands of listeners. People didn't just hear a homeless woman's voice. They heard a mother, a wife, a grandmother, a person whose life had unraveled piece by piece until she no longer recognized her reflection. The comments poured in not just sympathy, but action. Donations were collected. A small nonprofit offered a room in a transitional housing program. A doctor reached out to offer free medical evaluations. People from as far away as Oregon and Maine sent letters and packages to the community center where Margaret had temporarily been placed after her story spread. But what struck Margaret most were the handwritten notes that came tucked into envelopes, many without return addresses. Some came with $20 bills, some with nothing but ink. You matter. Your story helped me talk to my own mother again. You reminded me to see the people I walk past every day. One note, scrawled in a child's handwriting, simply said, "Thank you for not giving up." Margaret read them all, every single one. She kept them in a shoebox by her bed in the small room she now stayed in, reading through them some nights when the noise of doubt crept back in. But the letter that changed everything came late one afternoon, slipped into a larger stack of envelopes brought to her by a staff member at the shelter. The return address was familiar. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the page. "Mom, I saw your face before I even pressed play. I knew it was you. I'm sorry I didn't come looking. I thought you needed space, but maybe I mistook your silence for strength. I'm in the city. Please call me. I miss you. The boys miss you." It was signed simply Marissa. Margaret sat holding the letter long after she had finished reading it. Her heart beat loud in her chest, not with fear, but with something closer to awe. Not all broken things stayed broken. Some things, if held carefully enough, could still find a way back together. And in that moment, she realized that while hunger had brought her to that corner, it had never been about the food. It had always been about the hunger to be seen, remembered, loved. And now, perhaps, she would be. The day Margaret stepped out of the city shelter for the last time, the air felt cleaner, not because the smog had lifted or the buses were quieter. Nothing had changed in the city's rhythm, but something inside her had settled. Her movements, still slow and careful, carried a certainty she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't walking away from the street just to escape it. She was walking toward something, and for the first time in a long while, she knew what that something was. Her reunion with Marissa had not been dramatic. It had been quiet, emotional in a way that didn't need raised voices or running embraces. Marissa had met her outside the shelter's entrance with red-rimmed eyes, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers and a paper cup of tea. They had stood in silence for several seconds before Marissa spoke, her voice trembling with guilt and relief all at once. "I'm so sorry it took this long." Margaret had nodded, unsure what to say, but certain of what not to say. There would be time for explanations, for apologies exchanged in both directions, but not yet. At that moment, it was enough just to exist side by side again. They hugged without hesitation, awkwardly, tightly, and in that embrace, something was mended. Marissa had insisted her mother come stay with her temporarily. She had made up the spare room, washed the sheets twice, and placed Margaret's favorite mug from years ago on the kitchen counter, as if no time had passed. The boys, now older than Margaret remembered, had been shy at first, unsure of how to greet the grandmother they had last seen in photos and fading memories. But children have a remarkable ability to read emotion, and within minutes, they were seated at the dining table, asking her about stories from when their mom was little and if she still knew how to bake apple pie. Margaret hadn't cooked in a long time. Her hands, stiff with arthritis, weren't as precise as they once were, but that didn't matter. With Marissa's help, she stood in a warm kitchen again, the scent of cinnamon and vanilla slowly reclaiming its place in the corners of her identity. When the pie came out slightly too brown on the edges, they laughed together. Real laughter, not the kind people offer out of politeness or to fill silence. But the transition wasn't without difficulty. Margaret had spent years learning how to shrink into herself, how to carry pain in silence. Now, in a space full of care and structure, she found herself having to unlearn habits of invisibility. She would still wake before dawn some mornings, sitting at the edge of the bed in the dark, clutching the shoebox full of letters from strangers who had reminded her she mattered. Marissa sometimes found her like that and would sit beside her without saying a word, offering her presence instead of pity. Word of Margaret's story continued to spread, not because anyone forced it into the spotlight, but because people clung to it, perhaps in part because it reminded them that redemption doesn't require perfection, that healing is possible even after long silence. She was invited to speak at a small local school, where a teacher had shared Ethan's story with her students. The class wanted to meet the woman whose life had been changed by a single sandwich. Margaret had hesitated before agreeing. Public speaking had never been her strength, and she wasn't sure she could offer anything beyond what had already been said. But when she stepped into the classroom, the faces of those children, wide-eyed listening, gave her courage. She told them her story, not with bitterness or dramatics, but with plain truth. She spoke about what it meant to be unseen, how loneliness could build slowly until it became as heavy as any hunger. She told them about Ethan, about his question, and how it shattered the silence she had come to accept. When she finished, a little girl with dark curls raised her hand and asked, "Do you think kindness is contagious?" Margaret smiled softly. "I do," she replied, "because one boy reminded me I existed, and now I get to remind others the same." The principal, deeply moved, asked her afterward if she would consider visiting other schools. Not every week, just when she felt up to it. Margaret agreed, not because she wanted recognition, but because she had learned that sometimes the most powerful stories were not told on television, but across cafeteria tables and inside classrooms, where futures were still forming. Back home, Ethan had no idea the extent of what he had done. His mother had shown him parts of the news coverage, and he had seen a few of the comments online. But to him, Margaret was not a symbol or a story. She was a real person who'd been hungry and had needed a sandwich. That was it. A few weeks after Margaret had moved in with Marissa, they received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a drawing. The picture showed two people sitting side by side on a bench. One was clearly a boy, the other an elderly woman. They were sharing a sandwich. Beneath it, in large block letters written in blue crayon, were the words, "Friends Forever." Margaret didn't need to check the signature. She knew it was from Ethan. Marissa watched her mother read the note, tears brimming in her eyes, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Margaret smiled, held the drawing close to her chest, and whispered, "He gave me more than food that day." She framed the picture and hung it near her bed. From that point forward, Margaret became an unofficial speaker for the shelter's outreach program. She spoke not from a place of theory, but from lived experience. She helped draft new training guidelines for volunteers, focusing on dignity-centered interaction. She participated in roundtables with local policymakers about long-term support for elderly homelessness. And through it all, she never forgot that none of it would have happened if not for one boy who had stopped to ask a question when everyone else walked past. She still walked with care, still moved slowly, but her steps had direction again. She spent Sundays cooking with Marissa and the boys, sometimes just slicing fruit or stirring pots, while others did the heavier work. Her life didn't become glamorous. She didn't win awards or write books, but she became, once more, what she had long ago stopped believing she could be, part of community. On a chilly spring afternoon, sitting on a bench in the park not far from where she used to sit and beg, she watched a young mother walk by with her child. The child dropped a toy, and before the mother could turn around, a stranger picked it up and handed it back. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable. But Margaret saw it, and in that quiet human moment, she smiled. She no longer needed to ask herself whether she was invisible, because now, wherever she went, people looked at her and smiled back.